Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive. It's been a while, but we're coming back, and we're coming back strong, this time with another edition of my vinyl collection, music collection updates. It's been a bit since I've done one of these. The last time that I did one was back around Record Store Day, which, given the amount that I spent during that time, meant that I had to take a bit of a break from the whole collecting thing. I have not bought really much music at all since then, apart from maybe a couple of used CDs here and there. But I did had the opportunity to go out and buy a bunch of stuff this weekend with a friend of mine. And so I wanted to kind of go through what I purchased, kind of talk about some of the additions to the collection, and get up to speed. And also just put a video out on this channel because it has been a hot minute. Life is very busy. Life has gotten in the way of making these videos. I'm hoping to be able to bring them a little bit more regularly now to you in the midst of the chaos that is existence. In any case, we've got several records to go through, about like 8 of them, give or take. But we also have some CDs. I've mentioned probably off and on that I might do a roundup of the CDs in my collection at some point, although that would be an extremely long series, longer substantially than the vinyl collection series was. So we'll see what happens. But I did want to talk about the CDs that I acquired, just in the context of everything else. And the one that I'm going to start off with is one that I actually want to kind of spend a little bit of time on, because this is the one CD that I did not get on my record store outing. Now, this is Kaylee Matuszak's Leading Lady. Now, Kaylee Matuszak is probably not a name that most viewers of my channel are familiar with. I became aware of her actually through Twitter, or X now, as it were, where she has a pretty active social media presence. She's a really fun and interesting follow. But I was drawn to her social media presence because she is someone who is she's from Minnesota. She's a local artist. And she makes a lot of posts about music and also about just kind of the state in general. She is based out of Duluth, Minnesota. She actually has a job kind of in the shipping industry. It's a big port town, of course. So her gig is kind of related to that. She posts a lot about it. And she released this album, and I ended up picking it up through a Twitter exchange where she left it at one of those little free libraries. If you're aware of what those are essentially little kind of nooks in these kind of downtown areas where it's kind of one of those take a book, leave a book type of things. She ended up leaving one of those CDs there, so I went ahead and picked it up because, support local artists and everything, but also because her overall musical style is really interesting. She's a singer-songwriter, and it is, the hallmark of cringe in to compare a female singer-songwriter to Joni Mitchell, just because it is such a go-to comparison. It's such a stereotypical one that I think that's usually kind of the calling card of someone who does not have much exposure to female singer-songwriters. And when I say that her music reminds me a little bit of Joni's, I don't even know if it's entirely the lyricism per se. A lot of it, I think, is the timbre of her voice, kind of sits in a very similar register. But there's also, especially in her lyrical topics, which are very Minnesota specific. There's a lot of kind of references to shipping in her words. The topics are very what you would expect from someone who comes from a Midwestern background, or perhaps even in upper North America background, like a Canadian background, for instance. I think the reason I've discovered her Twitter was because she posted a lot about Gordon Lightfoot, which #respect. We love Gordon in this house. And I definitely hear some of that, whether that's in the melodic choices, whether that's in her approach to instrumentation. It's a relatively sparse album, heavy acoustic guitar presence, light percussion, some accordions being thrown into the fray, courtesy of, I want to get his name right, Steve Sokella, who I believe is a local kind of musician, local like kind of multi-instrumentalist who kind of jumps around. I know Rich Mattson, the producer, has worked with quite a few local acts. I think the most famous act he's produced for was Trampled by Turtles. So it's really well worth checking out. I think anyone who is a fan of the Canadian singer-songwriter aesthetic, if you will probably be drawn to this. It's really solid. You can get it on Bandcamp. Please do. Obviously, there aren't very many CD copies of this, but if you ever catch her live, I think she does still sell some of these at her performances. So, well, we're checking out. Really good. Really liked it. And for anyone wondering, if you follow me on Twitter at music_deep dive, you will see that I traded this CD in exchange for a copy of Bob Dylan's Tempest that I purchased while I was at the record store. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll be able to figure out exactly where that little free library is, and you potentially can get yourself a free copy of Bob Dylan's seminal 2012 record, Tempest, which he is touring very heavily right now, and which I am fortunate enough to be able to go see in a couple of months, month and a half actually. It's coming up pretty soon here. Speaking of Dylan, I did add a few Dylan CDs to my collection. I've been going through his discography chronologically, revisiting it, really trying to sit with the records a little bit more in preparation for this show. And I've been trying to kind of fill the holes in my Dylan CD collection as I go along. I think I have about half of his records on CD. So I'm kind of just filling in holes as I continue here. John Wesley Harding, 1967, very lyrically dense record. It's interesting. It's a murky but not especially complex album musically, which is not to say that the playing is poor. It's more so, I think, just a testament to the simplicity of the arrangements. I think really allows for the lyricism to come through. But when I say that the lyricism comes through, I don't mean in the sense that it's obvious, and I don't mean in the sense that it hits like a truck. I mean that for some of the kind of character portraits and ideas that Dylan is trying to grapple with here that are so fundamentally beguiling and confusing, it almost feels like you have to keep everything fairly straightforward from an instrumental standpoint. Otherwise, you're just going to lose everybody and you're going to turn into some, like, I don't know, progressive rock bullshit or whatever. No offense to my prog rock lovers out there. I jest. It's all in good fun. But John Wesley Harding is great. Not necessarily my preferred late 60s Dylan record. I do think I prefer Nashville Skyline a little bit, but really solid. 1970s New Morning here. A remastered copy from like 2010, I want to say. Solid album. I'm still not, I know some people who adore New Morning. I'm not quite at the point where I'm one of those people, but it is certainly like, it is domestic bliss Dylan. And it is a representation of what Dylan wants perhaps his life and his career to look like. And in that sense, it's a kind of a revealing album in that sense. But again, he kind of keeps you at arm's length with a lot of these joke tracks like If Dogs Run Free that are, you know, maybe not like If Dogs Run Free, I know is like supposed to be this like play on the idea of beat poetry and things like that. Not necessarily like a loving play on beat poetry, not necessarily a sardonic or a malicious one. But again, I don't know. New Morning is still, I think, a record that just in terms of its approach, I'm not entirely sure what to make of it. I do like it, and I do like it quite a bit, but I'm not quite at the point where I'm loving it. I think I still need to sit with it, and maybe having more of an emotional connection with Dylan as I re-explore his discography will help with that. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Yeah, I think this is a lot of fun, honestly. People rag on it a bit just because of the fact that it's a soundtrack and that it exists and that the appeal of Dylan is in the words and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's fine. But, you know, the tunes that Dylan is writing here and the actual like musical arrangements are really interesting. I'm not going to go here and say that this is fucking Ennio Morricone levels of like Western film soundtracking or anything, but I appreciate the approach. I appreciate the sound. It's enjoyable. I've not seen the film yet. I'm very curious to, but for what it is, I think it's a little bit. I think it's ragged down a little bit too much by the Dylan fan base out there. Although I'll be honest, I like Knocking on Heaven's Door. It's not my preferred version of Dylan, if I'm being honest. A little bit too grandiose for what I personally like the most out of Dylan. I'm not saying it's anything poor. I'm certainly not saying it's overrated. But admittedly, not my favorite classic Dylan song by any means. Planet Waves. I've been exploring the band's discography a little bit, kind of in conjunction with this Dylan dive, and it's been well worth it. I've never been like super into the band, so hearing their stuff, especially music from Big Pink, of course, which everyone loves, and I've always liked, but I've never like really clicked with. It's been a revelation, and this album has grown on me. I love this. I think this is a phenomenal album, both from a playing standpoint and just, I think the songwriting is confessional and sharp in a way that Dylan will further refine on Blood on the Tracks. But boy, I think this is a much more major, like, this is much closer to Blood on the Tracks than I think most people give it credit for. Rock solid album, really, really strong. And also, I think I said this already, but some of Dylan's best singing, I think, on this record. An album that is generally perceived as being good consistently by everybody, but fuck it, man. I'll say that's definitely one of his best 70s albums, and it might be my second or third favorite of his 70s records, honestly. Really good. Okay, Dylan is done. George Harrison, Dark Horse. Possibly my least favorite George Harrison album. Although I think I want to re-explore it. The reason I bought it was because it's one of the very few George albums that I don't own on CD. And I think the big hang up with this record for me has always been George's voice. Of course, developed throat problems that turned into a full-on case of laryngitis in the middle of 1974 when he was recording the album. And of course, he ended up tracking the vocals last out of everything. So he tracked the vocals when his voice was in like the worst possible state it could be. Then he went on tour after this in the United States. And it was just a very, I think, strange time. And the album was relatively well received and the tour was well received. So I don't think this was something that actually like translated over to fans. I don't think fans necessarily perceived that George was struggling, but in hindsight, when you listen to this record and when you listen to the bootleg tapes of some of those shows, which I have, it's kind of rough going. But I do think these songs, I think, are a little bit better than I've given them credit for. And I've learned as a music consumer to not value vocals either as much or to value more eccentric approaches to vocals over time. So I think when I revisit Dark Horse, I will find that that the vocals are not as much of a barrier for me. And frankly, Ding Dang is a lot of fucking fun. The fucking New Year's track, or whatever it's called, that's a lot of fun. Gorillaz, Plastic Beach. Probably second favorite Gorillaz album. I don't think I like this more than Demon Days, at least not yet. But I cannot deny that this is some of the most creative kind of, rock adjacent, electronic adjacent, hip hop adjacent music out there. For my money, and not that I'm a huge Blur expert, but I would dare say that Gorillaz is my favorite Damon Albarn project. I just love the emphasis on collaboration in all of those albums, and I love the kind of left field genre turns that they're willing to dive into kind of at any given moment. It's so creative, and it's so creative in ways that it doesn't need to be. The backstory, the artwork, the videos for all of these songs and these records and things like that. It's just really well done. It's really clever. And even when Gorillaz misses, for me. Like Humans, I was not a fan of really at all at the time. It's still, I applaud the effort. I applaud the effort overall. I respect the commitment. Okay, I have been getting lately very into the Boy Genius members' solo records. I am a big fan of Boy Genius, and I've been a big fan of Phoebe Bridgers for a long time. But I had never heard a Lucy Dacus solo record, and the only Julian Baker record I had heard was no, Little Oblivions. Little Oblivions was the only one I'd heard. So I did a dive into all their stuff, and I came away actually with CDs, one CD each of Julian and Lucy, and one vinyl record each of Julian and Lucy, since I have all of Phoebe's and Boy Genius's stuff on both mediums. Sprained Ankle, Julian's debut record. I think Julian's stuff is all super, super close together for me. I know a lot of people say that Sprained Ankle is her best, and I understand why. Think you could certainly make an argument that these are her strongest and most unique tracks from a songwriting standpoint, and her two albums afterwards are more or less kind of variations on the same idea. I will say I think Turn Out the Lights, to me, as we're going to come to, spoiler alert, I think does some of the sound a little bit better for my ears. But yeah, it's certainly, I think, it's a lovely record. I think just how like raw and transparent she's willing to be about, just kind of the mental anguish that she talks about in these songs. I mean, it's so kind of sharp. And I think that is the edge that I think she adds to the Boy Genius albums, is that kind of very raw, very confessional, no holds barred approach, which is why it's interesting that this is actually an extremely soft record, because I generally associate Julian's contributions to Boy Genius as being the heavier ones, more guitar centric, things like that. But there's actually a lot of kind of acoustic and piano sounds on this record and on the following one. So Sprained Ankle, really good. All Julian stuff, I think, is all really good and all very close together for me if I had to rank them. Historian by Lucy Dacus, possibly now my favorite Boy Genius solo project. I might still put Punisher ahead of it, because Punisher I've known for longer. It hits a spot for me emotionally. Again, Phoebe, I think, not as like, she doesn't kind of rip off her own skin as much in a way that like Julian does from a lyrical standpoint, but when she delivers cutting lines, they cut like a knife. And Lucy's into that as well, but I think when I'm not necessarily going to Lucy Dacus for super, super confessional, revealing stuff. I think she seems like a very observant individual who observes characteristics in people, in her partners, in herself. And I think that's the appeal of the lyrics to a lot of her records, which are also all really strong. But Historian, I think, is especially spectacular just in how these songs kind of build up, how they, some of the chord progressions she's using, some of the dynamic twists and turns on these tracks. Like Non-Believer, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. I was really wanting to pick this one up specifically on vinyl, but unfortunately, this was the one Lucy Dacus project they didn't have in stock. So I'll have to wait on that, but I made sure to pick up the CD. Historian's terrific. I think maybe from a songwriting standpoint, not to get into the debate of like what should be considered good songwriting versus what shouldn't, but if I'm tearing, apart all these songs and putting them all, each of them in a room with an acoustic guitar and just asking them to play these songs straight through, a part of me thinks that Lucy's songs would hold up the best in that setting and would be the most effective in that setting. And I think that says something. That is not me saying that I think Lucy is my favorite member or anything like that. I'm not going to get into that debate, but I think it's really phenomenal. I think these are fundamentally just really sound. And yeah, it was a powerful record. It floored me when I first heard it. So highly recommend it. Okay, last CD. I made a point. I try to make a point now of getting at least one thing at these record stores. This was Electric Fetus, by the way, in Minneapolis, in case you're curious. I make a point of getting at least one thing that I haven't heard. So I think the last time I got Waxahachie's Tiger's Blood, which I have heard since then, and it is a phenomenal record. Although I don't know if I like it quite as much as I do St. Cloud, but that's neither here nor there. So this time the record that I got was one that I had heard previews of on like NPR and things like that, and I knew I generally liked this person's aesthetic, but I'd never heard a full album, and that is Clairo with Charm. I'd heard snippets of this record in the morning on a radio show when they were interviewing her. And my thought was like, I can already tell I'm going to love this just sonically, even if the songs themselves don't make a huge impression on me. And, I predicted it for the most part, except I think the songs are actually a lot better than I was even expecting them to be. I listened to Clairo's discography. Well, I hadn't heard the CD when I bought it, but I actually listened to her stuff earlier today as I'm recording this. And it's, I think she is a classic example of an artist who seems to grow more confident and make more interesting creative decisions with each new release. I think that her first full-length record, Immunity, is a very solid debut. I think maybe not necessarily up to par from a songwriting standpoint with her next two, and I think the production especially feels a little bit, kind of by numbers, rote, doesn't really stand out. But on Sling, her second record, I think she does extremely well. I'm a Jack Antonoff defender for the most part. I think that's some of my favorite work of his. The production touches that he adds to that album. And Charm, and I wish I had the guy's name in front of me, but the producer that she works with on Charm adds this extra element. Like, this is not a neo soul record, but the producer has a background in producing for soul artists. He's has plenty of experience in the genre himself, and he clearly is adding this like very adept touch to these tracks that works really, really well with Clairo's very kind of soft, wistful vocal style. I would not really describe Clairo as a superb vocalist. I don't know if anybody would, but technical prowess is not really the focus of her style, and I think she has learned as a musician to kind of work around her voice in a really interesting way, and she's picked producers now who are adding these more interesting elements to really just couple well with everything. And that's what, before you get to the lyrics, which are this mixture of pretty confessional, somewhat sensual, I suppose, but again, doesn't necessarily lean into that side of things too much. It feels very honest. And I know Clairo is someone who gets critiqued from some people of being a quote unquote Nepo baby, which I think is an accusation that a lot of female pop stars get thrown at them in especially recent years, which for however much they may be based in reality, I think it's become a very gendered insult, if nothing else, and should be reevaluated, but I digress. I think it's a really interesting album. It's really lovely, lush, beautiful to listen to. Not necessarily the season of the year, I suppose, that I would recommend listening to it. It's about 90 degrees in my city as I'm talking about this right now. But I'll be putting that shit on in the fall, and that is going to go hard. And by go hard, I mean it's going to go soft, and it's going to be perfect for those 50-degree days when the leaves are falling off the trees and everything is going into hibernation, and when the world is, to me anyways, as beautiful as it ever is. But anyways, enough about the autumn. Let's get to the vinyl. The first one is the only one of these, only one of the records that I did not get at Electric Fetus. This one I actually got from boring old Target because I've been eyeing this for a while. I finally heard it, and I think it's phenomenal. And that is, of course, Billie Eilish's Hit Me Hard and Soft, her third album that has been praised to hell and back this year. And when I heard it, it was, yeah, and I realized it was for good reason. I've always been a big Billie Eilish fan. I shouldn't say always, because I was a bit late to the party on her music. I wasn't aware of her before her debut came out. But When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go is, I think, one of the best pop albums of the 2010s. I don't think that's a very controversial take. I think, you can say whatever you want about Phineas's production being the backbone of that record, and it certainly is, but I think without Eilish's lyrical approach and without her vocals, it doesn't work. I don't think you can separate the two. Granted, I haven't heard Phineas's solo album. I'm sure that's good, if not great, but they work best together, and that debut album shows it. Happier Than Ever is phenomenal, but I hate to say it, but Happier Than Ever, I think, is my least favorite of the three, because this record, if anything, I think almost goes back to the more electronic focus, the more unconventional sort of textures that the debut is experimenting with, but also throwing them into song structures that are more conventional. I think the thing with Happier Than Ever is that Happier Than Ever feels a little bit more kind of by the numbers and a bit safer, which is understandable. I think Billie herself has said that she wanted to, she felt it was important to kind of go in that direction because she thought that I don't know if it was like her career needed more legitimacy to it or something, or she needed to make the record as a response to a lot of people, to prove that she was a more versatile artist than they were giving her credit for. But, no shade against that record, but this one is phenomenal. And I think what works about it in comparison to the other two is it feels stereotypically more mature. She is, this is the first record she's made since she, formally came out, if I'm not mistaken, and her sexuality is a huge topic on the lyrics here. And with that sort of dive into more uncomfortable, not uncomfortable, but more personal, more private, intimate, lyrical ideas, with that dive becomes this ability to kind of express herself vocally. Some of her best vocals ever are on this record, which again, maybe you can attribute to that renewed confidence. And on top of that, I think you have, again, these songs with these just really fucking sharp hooks, really great production. Everyone's been talking about Birds of a Feather, and I don't have anything to add beyond what everyone else has said. Birds of a Feather is phenomenal. Probably one of the best pop songs of the decade so far. Yeah, it's really great. It's a great album. And again, she's at the point where I'm almost convinced she can do no wrong. I don't necessarily know if she is my favorite pop star just from a personality standpoint. I admire her personality. I don't know if she's someone who, if we had been in school at the same time, I would have been friends with or something like that. But I think that as far as who is making the most interesting creative decisions in the major label pop mainstream right now, Billie is certainly up there. If not the most creative major pop star going right now, she is absolutely leading the charge. And I'm just so excited to see where she goes from here. I'm so excited to see kind of this next generation, whether that's late Gen Z, whether that's Gen Alpha, as they start coming of age and start putting out material. I think it's going to be a really potent time for pop music and for a lot of genres of music. I'm really excited to see what happens from here. Okay, we continue. Couple of used records. We have the Supremes sing Holland Dozier Holland. Possibly the best Supremes album. I would need to properly go through their discography to verify that, but God, really, really sharp, really great collection of tracks from, one of the most successful groups of the 1960s, obviously, and one of the best pop vocal groups of all time. I don't know that I would call the Supremes an album band per se, just because, again, I don't necessarily know that they thought of their music in those terms as much as other bands or artists, but I think they get away with it, and they get away with having albums that are still really strong listens because of the strength of their material, because they were great performers, because as a result of their performing ability, they got a lot of strong material from other artists, staff songwriters on Motown and things like that. And, as a result of that, even though maybe they're not thinking of these albums as these cohesive pieces of work, their albums still end up standing up really well compared to, really well over the test of time compared to a lot of other groups from that era. Of course, I think the best track on here is "You Keep Me Hanging On." I know a lot of rock fans who watch this channel might be more partial to like the Vanilla Fudge version of that track, which is cool. The Vanilla Fudge version is awesome, but give me the Supremes any day over a lot of things, really. We're gonna come down crashing back to earth with these next two. These next two records I got purely for completionist's sake. Keeping the Summer Alive by the Beach Boys. This is a terrible album. Absolutely awful album. This was the final record they made before Dennis Wilson died, before Brian Wilson went back into treatment with Dr. Eugene Landy. Carl Wilson was suffering from alcoholism at this point. I think there's a story of the song "Living with a Heartache" on here where Carl was so drunk that he had to stand against, like he was leaning against a barn wall to record his vocals because otherwise he would collapse. It's messy. It's all over the place. It doesn't sound good. Dennis is actually barely on here at all. And yeah, I will defend some of the late career Beach Boys records more than others. I'll go to bat for LA Light Album. I'll go to bat for the self-titled. Definitely go to bat for the self-titled. But I can't do it for that one. I think it's as bad as its reputation states, and I'm literally only getting it because it was there for cheap. I don't have it, and I'd like to get as many Beach Boys records as I can. So there you go. In a similar vein, Ringo Starr, Bad Boy. The fun part about Bad Boy is, the fun part about this copy of Bad Boy is that this is actually a promotional copy. So that's interesting, I suppose. Bad Boy is also pretty poor. This came out right after Ringo the Fourth. For those of you who watched the Todd in the Shadows video on Ringo the Fourth, that is a chaotic record at the best of times. And I tend to defend Ringo the Fourth at least a little bit, not that much, but somewhat compared to others who think it's one of the worst solo Beatles albums. Bad Boy just feels like Ringo the Fourth, but take away all the interesting bits of it. Like all the kind of almost drunken shouting that characterizes that record. And this is just a very generic kind of collection of covers, a couple of original materials, if memory serves. And then the final track, A Man Like Me, which is actually a rewrite of the song A Mouse Like Me from the soundtrack to the animated film Scouse the Mouse, which Ringo recorded the soundtrack for. So, obviously, very uninspired, very bland. What can you do? But again, I have Ringo albums on vinyl that are even worse than that, so of course I was going to get it. Okay. Now to some good stuff. I mentioned that I had one record each from Julian Baker and Lucy Dacus, just as I do CDs. So for Julian, I have what, as of right now, is my favorite Julian Baker album, Turn Out the Lights. I think this does a lot of what her debut record does, but it kind of cranks everything up a notch, which I really like because I think, ultimately, and kind of tying into her confessional style of songwriting, Julian has a very sort of punk energy, pop punk energy to how she writes her melodies, how she conveys emotions. And I think this record has a lot of these kind of huge builds in it that just really work for what she's trying to do, at least as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I think Over is great. The title track is phenomenal. And the closing track, Claws in Your Back, is terrific. Yeah, really, really great. I think Julian definitely gets short shrift from a lot of Boy Genius fans compared to Phoebe and Lucy. Simply because I think her aesthetic is maybe the most different in her solo material from the Boy Genius records compared to Bridgers and Dacus. But, I think especially if you are someone who enjoys a little bit of emo as a treat, a little bit of pop punk as a nice, fun addendum, then you will do well to check out her stuff. It's really good. It's really good. Changing the order of things over here to show off the Lucy Dacus record, Home Video. Definitely my second favorite Lucy album. I really like the kind of change in sound here. This is a little bit more kind of washed out of a production style, a little bit hazier compared to her first couple of albums. And I think that effect really works. Maybe, I know some people are not necessarily a huge fan of that change in style. I don't know. For me, I think her, like I said, her songs hold up in just about any context. And I don't think that the production differences here at all mask the songwriting. And I actually think, the songwriting here is incredibly strong. Hot and Heavy, Cartwheel, Partner in Crime, Please Stay. Just some gut-wrenching songs in there. Again, like I said, I think from an emotional standpoint, Lucy packs a punch in the way that the others do, but I think her punch is a more subtle one. I think her songs, like Julian, is very obvious with her emotional delivery. Phoebe kind of hits you with these lines that just kind of cut through like a knife. And then Lucy's kind of come on more gradually. You realize the sadness in some of these songs as it kind of unfolds and kind of spreads around you, and you kind of perceive it more fully over time. So Home Video, really solid, really great album. And I'm going to continue working to get complete on Julian and Lucy, because I really would recommend all of their albums, plus all of Phoebe's, to anybody. I think at bare minimum, they're all really, really good and really worth your time. Bob Dylan, Rough and Rowdy Ways. Got to show up the back cover. My man, JFK. Rough and Rowdy Ways is, a record that I heard not too long after it came out. Again, kind of in the context of having listened to Bob Dylan for the first time. I explored his stuff for the first time around the time of COVID, March 2020. And Rough and Rowdy Ways, of course, only came out a couple months later. And I liked it when it came out, for sure. But again, not having the connection to Dylan's music as much, I don't necessarily think I appreciated what about that record makes it stand out. And I revisited it recently, kind of in the middle of going through all those 70s albums. And what jumped out to me was, well, kind of everything. Maybe it was that moment that I needed of hearing this sound of Dylan in the midst of all these other kind of classic or semi-classic records that he was releasing. But this is so sharp, and it's grappling with so much that it's kind of unbelievable. I right from the beginning, I think Dylan is kind of confronting a lot of ideas about his own place in art. I don't necessarily think he's viewing his place in history, because again, I think that assigns a level of ego to him that at least publicly he wants to shy away from. But I do think this is Dylan talking about how he has interacted with art. I think Goodbye Jimmy Reed, of course, is a very clear kind of homage to his influences. And with all the great songs that are on here, I Contain Multitudes, of course. I think that's, a very cutting and revealing song in a lot of ways. For every great song that there is on here, I think Murder Most Foul is a track that books could probably be written about, which I know is very kind of a grandiose statement to make. So in trying to explain what I mean by that, I think with Murder Most Foul, and I've read other people's kind of interpretations of it too, so please don't take this as original thought entirely. Murder Most Foul feels like it's kind of twofold, right? I mean, the idea of Dylan making a song about the Kennedy assassination feels almost too fitting. And by that, I mean it feels too on the nose. I think if you had pitched that idea to me, and actually this was my reaction when I first heard it, it's almost like eye roll worthy. Like, certainly Dylan's has shown himself capable of great writing well into his old age. There's no indication to believe it was going to be bad, but it does feel like a very boomer core lyrical topic. But what Dylan does with it, at least this seems to be his intention, is he couples the actual kind of story and the emotions surrounding Kennedy's death with this perception of how we as music listeners go to art, specifically music in this song, but go to art in general as a way of coping with our grief, as a way of sounding our grief out through some sort of creative medium or some sort of expression, even if that means you are not actually creating whatever the art is, you are merely responding to it and interacting with it as you listen to it in your car or on the concert stage or what have you. And Dylan is kind of paying tribute to that. And in doing so, shouting out so many artists and bands who were either contemporary during that time, or again, going back to Goodbye Jimmy Reed, I think are really like huge influences on Dylan personally. And in doing that, you get the sense that Dylan, again, is both kind of talking about this larger cultural impact, but also talking about his own reaction to the assassination and also to the times. I think for as much as the song is about the Kennedy assassination on its surface, I think in reality it's kind of a sidebar towards a larger point about what the ethos of the 60s was and what the kind of defining characteristics of those times were. So it's a lot to chew on. And it's wild to think that a song written in 2020 could possibly be considered one of the defining statements of the 1960s, one of the most culturally and politically, socially important decades in the history of the West. But damn it if he didn't do it. And damn it if Dylan didn't write, a song for the ages, as I said, one of my absolute favorite Dylan songs now. So what can you do? It's great. It's a phenomenal album. And I needed to talk about that one a little bit longer than some of the others, just because that record in particular has been sitting with me a lot kind of mentally lately. So I knew if I saw it, I had to buy it. So here we are. And for context, I think that's my third Dylan record. I believe I have Highway 61 and Blood on the Tracks. So, interesting, but I think overall very solid start to the Dylan collection, which I would like to get complete someday. Another record I have been eyeing for ages and ages and ages, Kid A by Radiohead. What to say about Kid A? It's my favorite Radiohead album. I have been a huge fan of this record for a long time. I think I was always captivated by Kid A, from childhood, or from the first time I heard it anyway, so more like adolescence. I was always captivated by it because of how different it was. OK Computer was not as immediate to me. Well, it was immediate in the sense that I knew kind of what some of the appeal was, but Kid A was weird. And I was drawn to the weird things because I really wanted to understand what those weird things were about. So Kid A has always had kind of a special place in my heart. And yeah, now, I mean, I've got nothing but good things to say about it. It's not as much of a huge leap beyond OK Computer as you would think at first glance, but it at the same time, I think it mixes some of the more traditional kind of rock sounds and rock textures that wouldn't feel out of place on OK Computer. It mixes these with these other musical influences, whether that's electronica, whether that's fucking Charles Mingus like jazz in the national anthem. Whatever the case may be, I think it fuses everything super, super, super well. It's one of the most stylistically like diverse and creative records that they ever made as a unit. And it holds up so well. And every time someone refers to this record as just a bunch of bleeps and bloops, a little part of me dies inside. And that's no exaggeration. A small part of me literally physically ceases to exist every time someone condemns this record, or a lot of records anyways. It's just a bunch of bleeps and bloops. As someone who has experimented a little bit with synthesizers, I can promise you bleeps and bloops are very hard to make. They actually take a lot of creativity and skill and musical knowledge. And I think Kid A is one of the shining examples of what happens when someone who clearly knows a lot about music is making those aforementioned bloops and bleeps. In any case, one more record to go through now. And this was another one that I knew if I saw it, I had to get it because everyone's been talking about this artist this year. And I've been hearing about her for since kind of end of last year, I want to say. But I hadn't checked her stuff out until just a few months ago. And apparently this record's kind of hard to find now, at least for a decent price. I know Discogs, like you have to pay like $50, $60 for it right now, which seems insane. But it is Chappell Roan, The Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess. The debut record by one of pop's big up-and-coming stars right now. Again, if I'm thinking like, the two names who seem to have exploded this year are Sabrina Carpenter, who was known. I mean, people know her from like her Disney Channel days, and she's had some successful singles. But Sabrina has definitely come into her own this year, which has been cool to see. I've liked what I've heard of her stuff. I've not heard her, all of her recent singles, but I generally have respect for her. And what Chappell Roan is doing is really bringing back this, like, in a way, her sound is almost throwback-like. Like, there are certain songs on this record that I think almost have inspiration from these really old genres, like doo-wop or like 60s pop. But then this energy, like this sonic sound, like that clearly is drawing somewhat from the 80s, from 80s pop, but also from like 2000s emo. There's just, it's, not to use this overused term, but it is kaleidoscopic in a lot of ways with how much it's trying to do and how ambitious of a record it is. And you couple that with the image of Chappell Roan, one that is at least now, very based off of drag culture. I don't think it always was, but I think especially within the last year or two, she has really leaned into that inspiration. And especially given the time that we live in currently, politically in the United States, I think that it's an extremely bold stance to take. It's a bold move. And so you couple all this together, these very, like, there's so much going on ideologically, musically, topically, that so many people would kind of collapse under the weight of all that. But I think what Chappell Roan does is rise to the occasion, because she's actually a hell of a fucking singer. She's a hell of a fucking singer. I've seen videos of her live, and she kills it. And in the studio settings here, it's, you know, again, every professional singer has voice treatment applied to them on some level, but this is definitely a record where it feels extremely natural. Like, whatever touching up is being done here is not very obvious. And that works because then we get to see, even though, like, Chappell Roan is a stage name, she's not, as I understand, a very public person about her life in general. You know, it feels very revealing. It feels very honest and personal. And I think, certainly in the songwriting, especially, I think is. And it's the story of someone who I think who is trying to understand their queer identity and become confident in it. Like, there are themes in here that I think are certainly queer, but I think also could apply to heterosexual audiences in some way. It's, yeah, I don't know. The point is, there's a lot going on here, and on top of just, you know, everything you could dig your, you know, really dig your teeth into if you really want to, from a topical standpoint, from a lyrical standpoint, or whatever, the record's just also fucking fun. Like, I understand that Brat is kind of the album of the summer. It's got the club bangers of the year, and for good damn reason. Brat is a fantastic album. Thought about getting it, opted not to this time, but I probably will at some point. But this record is as well. This record is, you know, has so many fucking songs that are super energetic. I'm sure would translate super well into a live setting. And I think it's really, really great to see how fast she has risen. And I hope to see her kind of continue that success for as long as she wants it. But yeah, one of my favorite pop albums of the last year, for sure. Really cool to kind of see it get this like new lease on life this year with how much she's broken through. And yeah, what a year for pop music, in short. And that concludes my haul, my record haul, my CD haul, everything else. For those of you who made it through the whole video, thank you so much for sticking with it. Like I said, I've been absent for a while, but I hope to be able to post videos, again, a little bit more frequently as time, energy, and desire allows. But continuing to work, continuing to crank away back here on projects, podcast, reading, all that sort of stuff. And I hope to have more information for you soon. I really hope you enjoyed that. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more videos are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications, and then tell a friend as well. Really helps when people kind of spread the word. Word of mouth is the best way, after all, to share creative endeavors and get the word out to other people. So please tell people about this channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.